Hi, this is Hal Elrod in Cyber Physical Systems course at Georgia Tech Summer of 2019. And today we're going to review a paper on the economics of offline password cracking. And this paper was written by three folks from Purdue University. And the overall thesis of it is that they're going to build an economic model of an offline password cracker. So this is not, this assumes that you already have a file with hashed, salted passwords, and you're going to figure out what is a rational expectation in terms of the number of passwords it is worth for an attacker to crack. And again, assuming you already have the breach, and this turns out to be quite common, and there's been a number of very notable breaches of software password databases in recent years. So what's interesting about this paper and why I was attracted to it is it's about economics. We'll dive into some specifics about timing and complexity about cracking hash passwords, but fundamentally the paper is about a predictive model for the behavior of attackers. And the assumption is that attackers are not just malevolent forces, but that they are rational actors, that they are still going to be profit maximizing in the sense that they are going to crack passwords when it's economically advantageous to do so, and they won't when it's costs more to crack the password than it does to actually recover the value of the recovered password. The other thing that's interesting is, of course, this paper makes reference to a number of recent password attacks, and a couple of them, my passwords got stolen, which is, of course, annoying, and always interested in figuring out what was going on behind the scenes in those attacks. This paper was presented for the IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy in 2018, and the link is in the description on this recording. So the problem is that we have recent attacks, and some examples are those at Yahoo, Dropbox, LastPass, Ashley Madison, LinkedIn, and so forth, that have just in the last, this was written in 2018, but in the last year and a half or so, about 1 billion user records were stolen. And again, these are not just emails, but the actual encrypted, hashed password files. And so there's things are floating around. Once something is stolen, the assumption is that it's going to remain available. And obviously, we all know that there's a tendency among users to use the same password for multiple sites. And so my Dropbox password might be the same one I use for my Google Docs account or something. It's not, but it could be. So now, when you have a file, again, these are all these attacks here. They were not incredibly naive that they didn't store the password in plain text. They use a hash function, and in fact, it's salted and hashed. And a hash function is, of course, as you know, a one-way mathematical function that takes plain text, the word password, and then turns it into a numeric value, and such that any small change in the original plain text becomes a significant change in the output value. And robust hashes that are used today in most operating systems and in web servers are slow. They're intentionally built to be complex and slow. Bcrypt is one that comes on the Unix land. BBKDF2 is another one, and there's variants on it. And in fact, we'll see later that most of these passwords sites, the sites that have the passwords, actually use multiple iterations of the encryption. So, rather the hashing. So, the idea is to actually slow down. So the longer it takes, the less likely it is for these to be cracked. So is this true? The kind of model here we're going to look at is the hackers get access to a password file. They now have an offline file that they can deploy significant resources to cracking, and then they can use that and to make money. And of course, they make money by selling the credentials of users that are related in these password hacks. So the paper has 6 points. We'll go over some in more detail than others. But the first is a it's a sort of a framework for the damage of offline attacks. And again, the idea is if Yahoo loses 100 million hashed passwords, what is the value and cost associated with that? And so there's a framework that they develop to sort of model that behavior. Second is we're talking about Zipf's law, and that we'll talk about what that is, and the relating that model. Does it actually match what we see in user passwords? And the answer is yes, it does, and it's kind of interesting in and of itself. Third, they're going to have a kind of a threshold. It's a tau. It's not just capital T, but the letter tau that models the behavior of what a rational adversary would do, cracking passwords if this Zipf's law holds. Zipf's law we'll talk about has to do with the distribution of distinct passwords and how frequent they show up. And so depending on if this law sort of holds, then it's going to help us predict how many passwords are worth decrypting. There's also this effort to kind of do a upper-lower bounds on the fraction of passwords that a password attacker might crack. It's assuming Zipf's law doesn't hold. That's kind of a looser thing. It's a little more math, and we won't necessarily go into detail. And then finally, the paper applies this framework, this kind of mathematical model, to some of these notable recent password breaches and tries to make predictions about how many passwords would ultimately be cracked as a result of these. So the model, the first step in here is this economic model. And its assumption here is that password attackers are rational. Like in economics, this is a very frequent conversation. Basically the humans, even bad humans, are rational actors, and they're going to try to maximize profit. And so fundamentally, if you're going to be working to decrypt hashed passwords, it costs time and money to do it. Money in terms of computing resources, time, obviously. And so there's a value for a decrypted password. Let's say it's $1. I can sell it on the black market for $1. So I will go ahead and keep cracking passwords so long as the cost of getting the next password doesn't exceed the return, like $1. So if it costs me $2 to decrypt a password that is worth $1, I'm not a very effective password cracker, and of course no one's going to really do that. On the other hand, if it's cost me 10 cents, I will go ahead and continue guessing passwords and trying to recover more and more of these hashed passwords. So there's diminishing marginal returns. So that's a fundamental economic principle. If you have 500 million passwords, it's not 5 times as valuable as 100 million passwords because you're not going to be able to sell them for much. So. And the other case about the model is that it assumes the password attackers are offline. So I have all the time I want to use in the world, and it's also, these are hash and salted passwords. They're not like just open plain text or Pig Latin or something. These are hard things, and this is the case for many of them. So you have time, but there's still a cost for doing it. And again, passwords have value. In one study they reference, it's between $4 and $30. That seems a little high to me. Another study, specifically for Yahoo passwords, something between 70 cents and $1.20. Maybe. Again, there's probably a time value in there as well, but that's kind of an assumption that's going to help build the model in this the value associated with it. So the attack is, I'm going to try to crack a bunch of passwords. Okay, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to start with the most likely passwords and work my way down. And so the assumption in the model is that the password attacker knows something about the distribution of passwords. And again, this is very common. We have what's called rainbow tables, which tell us the most frequent 10,000, 50,000 passwords. Everybody uses password 123. That's the most likely, and then going down from there. But again, there's the assumption here is that the attacker doesn't know my password specifically. They just know kind of the distribution of passwords in the file. And the other thing is that this model assumes it's untargeted. They're not looking for your password specifically. They're looking for, they got a file of 100 million, and they want to find as many as they can that's economically profitable. If you're trying to do a directed attack, that's probably a different model. And then lastly, of course, I mentioned they're rational actors. They're going to stop guessing passwords once it's just too hard to do it. So you're going to go after the easy pickings. You're going to go after a certain point, but when it starts costing, hours and hours, months and months, thousands of dollars, you're going to stop guessing passwords. So the attacker, there's the high-level formula is very simple, and basically they're trying to maximize the threshold that is where the maximum return minus the cost. Okay, this is it's funny. This is a paper. It's in the IEEE, but it's really economically this is very straightforward. They're profit maximizing actors like farmers. Okay, so when you go to economics school, the first thing they teach you is supply and demand. Okay, and so a farmer is going to has a upward sloping supply curve. The more money you make, the more your quantity you're willing to produce, and so forth on the other way around. So the interesting thing about this model is it's very standard economic model for behavior of people in an economy. So actually cracking the passwords, is complex. Okay, so these are these models. They have the hash algorithms have parameters that control the runtime, and typically it's just iterations. Okay, so this thing we're going to look for, tau, is that kind of that sort of complexity of computing the password hash. And so if I do a bunch of iterations, tau is bigger. If I just have one iteration of a hash, it's probably very easy for me to compute. And we're going to get into some later on about complexity, but basically the most common hash algorithms are not memory bound, they're simply compute bound. So complexity, or tau, is just simply the number of iterations, and that's actually becomes the problem that this paper points out. Ideally, and they talk about something called memory hard hash functions. Ideally, you want the complexity of hashing to actually scale not linearly, but as a function of square or some other function. In other words, that if you double the complexity or double the time it takes to compute this, you quadruple the amount of time it takes to actually decrypt or reverse the hash. We'll talk about it a little bit later. So the actual cracking, the looking at the Yahoo breach in particular, indicates that the passwords follow this thing called Zipf's law. And so, what is Zipf's law? We talked about that. Okay, so it's named after this guy who's George Zipf, who was actually kind of a remarkable guy. Died relatively early, but was a professor at Harvard, and so we'll talk a little bit about Zipf's law, and this is a background that's not in the paper. But basically, Zipf's law is one of these kind of sort of like Pareto distribution, 80-20 rule. Well, in this case, it's about language or words or things that act like words. And it's the relationship is that given a large sample, big enough sample, that the frequency of a word is inversely proportional to its rank in the frequency. So, word, the 50th most popular word in the English language is 1/50th as used as the number one most frequent word in the English language. It's kind of a log-log relationship there. And it shows up, it holds true in a lot of languages. It holds true in a lot of other things. And the idea in this paper is that it holds true for password distribution as well, that the 10 most frequent passwords are disproportionately more frequent than the 1,000 through 1,010 most frequent passwords. And there's a relationship there. So a little bit of math on the actual the model, and we won't go through incredible detail, but basically the key factors of the model assumes as if distribution, so that in other words that there's frequency is biased towards the most top ranked are much more frequent than the less ranked. The attacker keeps attacking as long as it's profitable, but there's diminishing marginal returns. The rate of return is decreasing in there. And then there's this kind of equilibrium in the formula, if you kind of look at it, in terms of the complexity. So if it's this tau. So if the complexity is really high, then you're going to attack or crack fewer passwords. If the complexity is lower, you're going to attack more passwords. That's kind of the basic function of the math in this model that they use. And so then what they do is they then take this model, this kind of mathematical model on behavior, and then run it up against some recent attacks. So good old Yahoo. I had a Yahoo account years ago. Anyway, and so they 500 million users things. They were encrypted with bcrypt. Dropbox, almost 70 million users. It was bcrypt, and the tau, or the number of iterations, the complexity measure, was 256. So the good news is that Dropbox is, not incompetent. They ran 256 iterations of bcrypt on every password that was hashed there. Ashley Madison, this is that kind of adult affair site or something. They use bcrypt, but there was a deficiency in some of their password hashing, and some were actually hashed with MD5, which is a broken hash. It's basically, you might as well just put plain text. And it's like, if you can't trust an adultery site, who can you trust here? And so I didn't have my password there, but I did have my password with LastPass, and LastPass actually used 10 to the fifth, so 10,000 iterations of, I think it was bcrypt, which is a lot. So the tau on there is significantly higher than any other things. And again, LastPass, you'd expect them to be a little bit better, but in the model, it's probably profitable to crack, at least in their model, almost all the passwords. Even if it took 28 cents to crack, which is kind of there's assuming the cost of computing resources and so forth. And the reason why is because LastPass passwords, are more valuable. And so even though the complexity of the hash function is higher, or tau is higher, the value is higher as well. So at least in the model, and I don't know if this is necessarily true in real life, but at least in the model, most of these passwords probably got correct. And that's not necessarily good. And of course, anyone who had their password hopefully changed it. So, kind of what's the solution? And there's a couple options. Okay, one is to increase password strength. In other words, if I'm using words, if passwords follow Zipf's law, if I'm using really, really rare and obscure passwords, then it's really, really hard down that log path to find my password. But this is really hard to work. No one uses really hard passwords. It just doesn't work in real life. Everybody wants to use, if you say you must use numbers and a letter, it's going to be password 1. If there has to be a function, it's going to be password 1 exclamation point, and so forth. So kind of hard to make it actually do. The second one is, I don't know if it's totally practical, but the notion is using distributed password hashing. And this is a notion where you actually have multiple password files on multiple servers. And so if I'm going to authenticate into LastPass, it's going to have to combine 2 or 3 different password files through assume some XOR or something. And so any one individual password file is not useful. You have to have all of them. Honestly, this is proposed in the paper. I don't think it's particularly practical because the risk of outages and so forth, unless you have some really elaborate scheme, it seems very difficult. And then what they really recommend, though, is what they call key stretching, or in other words, making each hash harder and using memory hard functions. And a memory hard function is one where the complexity is not just the number of iterations, but also memory. So instead of just using making 5 iterations or 5 times harder, it's actually 5 times bigger in terms of memory. And there are some functions that will model that. We'll talk about that in just a second. Now, there's still organizations out there that are using SHA-1 or MD5, and that's just, so the point is, this is kind of theoretical here, but there's groups out there, companies, and I've seen some that have really bad password hashing. And so if you're using a broken hash, then you can have all the greatest password in the world. It is completely vulnerable when someone gets the password file. So the conclusion of the paper. So first is that conventional hashing just isn't enough for these offline attacks. If they have access to your password file, which can happen, you have a lot of time to be able to do it, and the old model of just running it through a one-way hash function is not sufficient, even if you run multiple iterations. So the recommendation is to use memory hard functions. So it's not just CPU bound, but it's actually expanding memory. scrypt is one of the algorithm. Argon 2D ID I'm not familiar with. And then ideally, you're using these secure distributed password hashing protocols, which again is a little more complex there. But you must protect these things more robustly than what was seen in the past. Otherwise, you're doomed. And again, doomed is all relative. Yahoo is no longer a separate entity. LastPass, they were able to recover, and I still use their software, but had to change my master password. These things, you have to assume that if your password file gets out in the wild and you don't have an incredibly robust hash function, that it will eventually be hacked and decrypted, and therefore your information will be lost. So that's the summary of the paper. I thought it was quite interesting and practical, at least in terms of the recommendations. And I, for one, am going to be watching and keeping close watch over any passwords I have hashed in my systems. Thanks.